Guys, Richard Holder here. Where's my big block fans? We all know how much I love to spend time at the wrecking yard, and one of my favorite motors, one of my go-to motors at the wrecking yard is a Gen 6 454. But what's even better than a junkyard Gen 6 454? Well, a modified version, 468 inches, heads, cam, and intake manifold. But what's even better than a 468? A 496. Let's check it out. In this video, we're going to take a look at a cool comparison. Suppose we're starting out with a junkyard 454. We have that, obviously, and that's a good way to go. But what happens if you upgrade that, especially if you upgrade it with forged pistons? And the reason that you do that is twofold. One, increased compression, more power, but also, and every bit as important, is that forged piston will have valve release, which allow you to add even more camshaft for even more power. Now, what if we run that with a stock head and an aftermarket head to show the difference in the 468, and then take one step further by doing the same thing with a 496? Let's check it out. Okay, you've decided to upgrade your 454. Obviously, we all want to go to the wrecking yard and put a camshaft in it and make 1,000,000 horsepower. But at some point, you really have to look into upgrading the combination. And on a big block Chevy, this is very important because it allows you to basically put more camshaft in. And that's one of the limiting factors of a junkyard small or big block, whether it's a Gen 5 or Gen 6. The available piston to valve clearance limits how much power we can make because it limits how much camshaft we can put in. So let's say you're going to upgrade the pistons on your 454, and when you do it, you're probably going to bore it out a little bit and make it like a 468 or something. And here's the thing to think about. Should I just do a 468, put pistons in it, use the stock rods, use the stock crank, and then go from there? That's obviously the low buck approach. Or should I step things up, and if I'm going to rebuild it anyway and putting new pistons, why not change also the crankshaft and the connecting rods and make a 496 out of it? So we're going to compare all of those and take a look. We're starting out with, this is a Gen 6 454 from the wrecking yard, and all we did was take the factory fuel injection off, put a dual plane carburetor and an intake and a distributor on it. And this will be our starting point. And you can see how far we've come with each one of these builds compared to basically the stock combination. So this is our Gen 6 454. It has, they come from the factory with hydraulic roller camshafts, and they come with a very small chamber head. Ours measured 102 cc's. It is a standard size oval port. It has bolt down rockers on it. As I said, we just put our dual plane on it, and our 750 carburetor made 378 horsepower and 482 foot-pounds of torque. Here's what happened. This is our first 468 build, and we'll go ahead and show you what happened here. You can see we improved the power output dramatically. Now, we made a number of changes to this, so let's take a look at those. So our 468 was basically a Gen 6 big block, but we upgraded the connecting rods and pistons. We used the factory crank, we just had it polished. Then we used a set of 6.385 rods and a set of forged dome pistons, 22 cc dome pistons, but they also had valve release, so that allowed us to put a bigger camshaft in it. The camshaft that we put in this particular combination was an Extreme Energy 294. It was a 540/560 lift split, a 242/248 degree duration split, and 110 degree lobe separation angle. We had 1.7 roller rockers on this combination, and we started things out, and I wanted to show you guys, the low buck approach would be just to use stock iron rec port heads, which we did in this baseline. We had a set of our dyno headers on it, which are 2 1/4 or 2 1/8 inch dyno headers. We had 1030 oil in it, and obviously we had an MSD distributor and did the timing. For this combination with the iron heads, it wanted to make best power at 42 degrees. And as we can see, the power output jumped up dramatically. It made 541 horsepower. Peak torque was 513 foot-pounds. Now, this shows what happens when you go with a stock-style rectangular port head. You can also use an 049 oval, and then you can also use ported versions of these heads. Lots of guys can do good work themselves, so a ported version of the head would also work. But I wanted to show you what happens when you put a very good cylinder head on it. In this case, this was an Airflow Research 265 oval port head and a matching oval port RPM air gap intake manifold. And as you can see, the AFR head is a very good choice for this displacement and this power output. It has plenty of flow. It flows more than enough to support this power level. and it also had a slightly smaller chamber, which raised the compression up to, this combination was about 10.3 to 1, and with the airflow research head, I think we were up about 10.7 to 1 because it has a smaller chamber. We made right at 600 horsepower, 601. Torque was up to 564 foot-pounds. And as you can see, it gained power and torque basically everywhere compared to the RecPort head. So if you're going to if you're thinking about wanting more power, an aftermarket head, and we ran a ton of these, the Airflow Research head, Brodux has a good head, Dart has a good head, Edelbrock. There's a lot of, TrickFlow, there's a lot of good head choices here that are going to make more power than the factory head. The other thing, as I said, you can port the factory head. But we ran a dual plane intake on both of these, but let's take a look and see what happened on with the AFR heads. We also ran a single plane, which picked up power, at least peak power, up to 622, and even peak torque was at 569 foot-pounds. But notice it lost a lot of torque below 4,700 RPM. So and I've shown these examples before, but in the single plane, dual plane thing with a big block, you're going to have to decide basically where you want your power. If this is a daily driver, honestly, I probably would pick the dual plane, maybe even port the dual plane to pick up a little bit, or add a spacer with the dual plane, like a 1/2-inch open spacer with the dual plane, and it would pick up more power at the top. But I like the fact that we have a bunch of extra torque down low, down at 3,500 or 3,400 RPM. Torque was up from 510 to 552 foot-pounds, and you definitely feel that driving around. So here's our 468 combination. Now let's take a look at the 496 combination. Okay, guys, now it's time to use a little bit of logic. Here's how this goes. Let's say you are going to step up from your junkyard motor and you're going to build a 468 like we did in the previous combination. You're going to buy, at the very least, you're going to need to buy forged pistons. Now, a lot of guys will also buy forged rods, but whether you get one of those or both of those, you're very close to just stepping up and getting a 496. You can get a cast crank usually for any kind of NA combination, and we've run these cast cranks with nitrous and blowers and all kinds of stuff, and I've never broken a cast crank. So that's the low buck approach. You can always get a forged crank as well, but if you get a crank and rods and pistons, I know it's a little bit of money, but you get a lot for that money. You get a lot more power. We're going to show you exactly what that is. So let's take a look at our 496 combination, and we'll start out again. This is our Junkyard 454 with a dual plane intake manifold, the carburetor in it made for 378 horsepower and 482 foot-pounds of torque. Here is our 496 combination. And just like the 468, we started off by running the 496 combination with a set of stock RecPort iron heads, like a guy might have if he was doing a hopped up version of a 496. Again, you could also do this with a set of stock or ported oval port heads like an 049 or even a Gen 6 head. If you did some porting on it, that would probably work fairly well too. But let's take a look at the rest of the combinations that went into the 496. So it was a 4.31 inch bore. It was a small dome piston, just like the 468. It was actually a 22 cc dome. It had valve relief so that we could put enough camshaft in it. Because this was a 496, we also stepped up in camshaft. Now we put a solid roller in this, but it was our kind of go-to, I call it a street roller. This one was actually designed for a blower application, but it works well NA, as we'll see here too. It was the Comp BR 300-14 cam. It was a 652 lift, a 255, 262 degree duration split, and 114 degree lobe separation angle. This was a Gen 6 block. We put the tall hydraulic roller or tall solid roller lifters in this. We had 1:7 ratio aluminum roller rockers from Comp, just like on the 468. We had a Victor 454R intake manifold, a single plane with a 950 Holley. We had the same dyno headers and we had mufflers on it. And this one had a Mylodon oil pan and windage tray on it. We had an MSD distributor, and this was run with the 088 stock iron RecPort heads to begin with. So run in this configuration, our 496 produced 631 horsepower and peak torque checked in at 578 foot-pounds. Again, big gains up from the standard 455 or 454 from the wrecking yard, but things got much better when we put a good cylinder head on it. And again, you could run a ported version of this 088 head or a ported version of an 049. Those work equally well, but there are a lot of good big block heads available for it. So let's take a look at see what happened when we installed a good set of cylinder heads on here. Let's go to our modified version. So this is what happened when we installed a set of Edelbrock ECNC 355 heads on it. Now these heads were, let's see if we'll grab our test description here. Yeah, these were ECNC, that says 335. They're actually 355s. So they're CNC ported, 355cc ports. These would be a much better choice on the bigger 496 than they would be on the 468. The AFR heads, those 265 heads, work very well on that smaller displacement motor. But these had 118cc chambers. They were full CNC ported. I'll go ahead and put some flow numbers up here for the video so you guys can kind of see what they flow. But they'll support fairly good power, as we saw here, because just putting the heads on improved the power output of this combination up to 715.7, so 716 horsepower. The peak torque was even up to 619 foot-pounds of torque. So it goes to show you what happens, first of all, obviously, when you put together a 496, and obviously what happens when you put good heads on it. And again, you can port the 088 heads or a rec port head, or port some 049s or even some late model Gen 6 heads, and get more power than we got there from just the basically bone stock set of heads. But a good set of heads on a big block Chevy goes a long way. So now let's take a look at one final thing. We'll compare the 468 and the 496 so we can see what happens and what happens when you step up in displacement. Now, obviously, either the 468 or the 496 buildups are going to make a lot more power than the junkyard motor, but how do they compare to each other? And so why would I need to step up? Obviously, if I'm upgrading my 454 to 468 status, especially modified, it makes lots of power. Why would I need to go further to a 496? What does it actually get me? So let's take a look at a comparison here. This is our 468. This was run with the stock RecPort 088 heads. And here is the 496 combination run with those same cylinder heads, so we can compare those directly. You can see the 496 does exactly what we would expect it to do. It's a bigger motor, it has more displacement, and so therefore it makes more power basically everywhere. Equipped with the same heads, the power output jumped on the 468 from 541 up to 631. So you're talking about 90 horsepower and a big jump in torque as well too. We went from a peak of 513 foot-pounds to 578 foot-pounds going from the 468 to the 496. So now let's take a look and see what happened in our modified versions with the, with a good set of cylinder heads. So if we look at our 468, and this is with the single plane intake, because we also ran the single plane intake on the 496. We'll get rid of our fuel flow chart, and then we will overlay our modified version of the 496 with good heads, and you can see we have a similar thing. So we made a lot more power, obviously, with the 496. Peak power is up to 716 horsepower from 622 horsepower. So again, almost 100 horsepower gain from the 496, although the torque gain was not quite as much, 567, let's see, versus 619 foot-pounds of torque. So obviously the the 468 had a bit more compression than the 496 in this case, and the AFR 265 heads did very, very well in terms of torque production on that 468. But as we saw, we made a lot more power with the 496. Like I said, almost 100 horsepower more. And that's what displacement gets you. So if you're thinking about upgrading, and obviously the cheap way to go would just be put a set of forged pistons in, use a stock rod, use a stock crank, and away you go. That's a good way to go. And use ported versions of the stock head. That works very well. But if you're thinking about upgrading the rods and pistons, I think maybe you should also think about getting a stroker crank, because it makes more power. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what do we learn in our comparison between the 468 and the 496? Obviously we learned that big blocks are great, and even bigger big blocks are even better. I mean, this is the reason that we went from a 350 to a 396 back in the day, and why we eventually went from a 396 to a 427 and then to a 454, because it's easier for the bigger motors to make more power. And not only do they make more power in terms of more peak power, which a Wilder combination usually does, but it makes more power everywhere. And here's the thing, and this is the important point I was trying to make with this video, is if you're going to upgrade your 454, now if you're going to do a junkyard motor, that's a whole different thing. But if you're going to upgrade that, put new pistons in it so you have more piston to valve clearance and so you have more compression, if you're going to do the piston upgrade and maybe a rod upgrade, then one more step gets you increased displacement, more power, and more torque. Armature holder guys, make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I will keep testing.